My guest this week is Susie Ballentyne. Susie and I have known each other since 2011 when I was running the Targeting and Information Operations Directorate in the Ministry of Defence, and Susie was running a team that worked very closely with mine. She's a social psychologist or a behavioural scientist, and she'll talk more about that in the interview that follows. And she's been doing that for over 20 years, initially for UK government, but she's also done quite a bit of work outside that as a consultant working with private and public sector clients, specialising in research, interpersonal influence and team development. She spent time out in Brazil, and she's now offering psychological training and coaching for individual clients, groups and teams. She's studying for a PhD at Sussex University, and that explores the relationship between forced migration, social identity and psychosocial well-being. She's very different to me in terms of skill set, that's for sure, but she's entirely complementary in terms of the skill set that we together brought when we founded Leading for Life, the leadership development company that we worked on together. And consequently, I'm delighted to have her on the podcast as an early guest to talk a little bit about why we think the things we're talking about with Leading for Life are important. Some of that comes from her own background, her own experience, and she'll talk a lot about what she sees as important leadership traits and skills and things that really matter. And hopefully it'll give you a better picture of me and why I'm doing some of this as well, because some of that will come out as we actually go through the interview. She's a fantastic person to talk to and a really, really great person to work with, so it's an absolute delight to have her. And without further ado, I'm Bob Judson. You're listening to Leading for Life Stories, and I hope you really enjoy what follows. Susie, welcome. Fantastic to have you on the podcast. I've really been looking forward to this conversation, given that we founded the company together. I think it's only appropriate that we have a good discussion about what that all means in terms of leadership and so on. So really great to have you here.
Thank you very much for having me. Lovely opportunity.
No, I'm really, really delighted, given that I think I'm sure we'll talk about it a bit more, but we've got very kind of complementary backgrounds here that work well for what we're trying to do with this. So that's an ideal combination. But I think our listeners have kind of got plenty of insight into my life over some of my recent posts and also podcasts, but clearly they know probably very little about you. So as my co-founder on Leading for Life, could you just give us a bit of a short summary of your career to date?
Yeah, sure. So I'm primarily always been in the public sector. So I'm a psychologist. I'm a social psychologist. Within sort of government work, we refer to ourselves as behavioural scientists. And I've always worked within that role. So I started having completed a degree in applied psychology. I moved on to DSTL, which was then DERA, Defence Evaluation Research Agency, that became Defence Science Technology Laboratory, in air systems, doing cognitive cockpits and head-up displays and things. And fairly quickly moved into research in what I thought was slightly more interesting areas, which were around then psychological operations, strategic communications, and looking at a better understanding of the challenge that presented. And this is back in the sort of late 90s. So going back a bit there. And then I had the opportunity to move to the Ministry of Defence to work as a psychologist in sort of policy analysis and advising on stratcoms work. And that took me through really sort of various conflicts in terms of, Balkans, West Africa, Sierra Leone, and then Iraq and Afghanistan. So a lot of my work then turned towards understanding things around the psychology of extremism, which led me to working as a behavioural scientist in the Home Office, looking at radicalisation, and then back to the Ministry of Defence again, doing more policy analysis work. But I hit a bit of a glass ceiling because behavioural scientists can only go so far. And at that point, it was either sort of leave behavioural science and go into something like helicopter procurement or something like that in order to work my way up, or move out. So at that point, I got asked by the FCDO as it now is, to come and help support their training and development around diplomatic and overseas staff, which I've been doing for the last 11 years. But in parallel to that, it gave me an opportunity to work outside of the public sector to pursue other avenues. So one of which was to start my PhD, which I'm just finishing, and then to look at other business opportunities and look at using those skills more widely across industry. So hence our paths crossing, having worked together in the MOD. And so that's where I find myself today.
Yeah, indeed. Yeah, it's a long time ago since we were in the MOD together doing that. Probably worth just saying a little bit about your PhD and what you're doing. I think that'd be quite interesting as well.
Yeah. So interestingly, not focused necessarily on sort of issues of defence and security, which is primarily where my work's been based, but really arose from a sense of working on various conflicts and realizing that there wasn't much understanding of what happens to people and populations when conflicts end. And so my PhD, which is under the supervision of Professor John Drury at Sussex University, is looking at the impact of identity change, social identity change, on those people who are forced to migrate. So I've been working with Syrian refugees in South America and Ukrainians coming to the UK under the Homes for Ukraine scheme to look at effectively how they manage to keep going. It's almost exploring the theme of resilience and looking at how people use their sense of identity and the relationships with people around them in order to manage the challenges and seize the opportunities that they face when they come to countries as forced migrants, i.e. not of their own volition, but needing to in order to find asylum. So really interesting work, sort of speaks to my other interest in the sort of more humanitarian area. But a lot of crossover with other models around motivation, resilience, and interpersonal relationships, which is a sort of theme of my work, I guess, over the years.
Yeah, I was just going to say, I mean, even though the PhD on the face of it sounds as though it's completely distinct from the sort of stuff we're talking about doing in the corporate world and the sort of leadership work we're doing together, I mean, actually, there's a lot of parallels in there, aren't there, around particularly, as you say, resilience and some of the themes associated with that.
Absolutely, yeah. I mean, the models I use are all about what happens when change occurs. And of course, change is occurring all the time. You know, in the context I'm looking at, it's very significant. You know, you are forced to flee your country. But for many people, the change, and when I've worked with other people outside of the PhD, it's been parents returning to the workplace after having children. It's people who are looking at retirement and seeing that their life is changing that way. It's where I'm working with teams who are merging, and the changes are around their sort of cultural and organizational identities. So the changes that occur in all spaces, the sort of theories that inform that are really helpful.
Fascinating. It'll be really really interesting when we get further into some of that detail, I think. Sticking with you a little bit and the going a bit further back into the past, what was it that sort of motivated you, and how did you get into that as at the start of your career from a psychology point of view?
Well, I mean, I started looking at psychology as an A-level back in the sort of early 90s, but I've always been interested in people and social influence in particular. So I think most people think about psychologists in terms of usually mental health, sort of internal cognitive processes. But I was always fascinated with sort of external social influences. So what is it that's going on in our world and the relationships around us that shape and drive what we do, why we do it, and how we do it? And, I was working very much, I mean, a lot of my family are public sector workers and military. And I was kind of always fascinated as to, why people join these organizations. I had no intention of ever wanting to join the military myself, but I was really fascinated by the behavior of the people I saw around me, either at home or work, the significance of wearing a uniform, how, stepping into the officer's mess would change your behavior, how the rank structure would mean that people would perform differently in front of one another. And I was very interested in that the social psychology that sort of swirls around and influences people. So that's always been a real sort of theme. And then I came across, I mean, this is going back now, sort of late 90s, there was a Royal Naval Reservist who was also a floor manager for Meridian Television, which used to be the kind of television station in the kind of south of England. And I was telling him about some of my work at DSTL, and he was saying, you should really contact someone called George Brander at DSTL, because he's doing work on psychological operations, i.e. the psychology of warfare, the hearts and minds. And immediately that just, for me, just brought everything together in terms of what I wanted to look at. He was using the analogy actually of a poppy and Remembrance Sunday and the kind of symbolism and significance of it, and how certain images and words can motivate people and really have a significant impact on the collective behavior of nations and people. And George Brander at that point was beginning to do work in that space. And so I joined his team in the late 90s. And that really sort of took my interest all the way through my career over the last sort of 20, 25 years. which continues to fascinate me. And of course, as we move into increasingly sort of digital and cyber environments, the information space and the role of the people and groups in those spaces becomes more and more significant. So there's never an end of the list of research questions that I get asked to look at.
Yeah, I'm sure. And actually, it'd be interesting to maybe discuss a bit later on, talk about the sort of impact of social media and the way the world works now as well, because that's clearly had a massive influence on this, just looking at the workplace in general and people's behaviour and the way they interact and so on and so forth, which is really challenging.
Yeah.
I mean, you touched on it probably a little bit, but role models, people that have influenced you. I'd be really interested in the ones that influenced you the most, who they were, what they did, and why they were really significant.
Gosh, it's a hard question to answer that, because I think I find it difficult, because I don't think I could ever just think of somebody in a work context, because I think there are people in your life in general that influence you and your perceptions of life and your motivations, whether that's in the sort of family context and you take that into the work context, or the work context and you take it into the kind of family context. Certainly, for me, moving into the SDL and working with George Brandon was a big shift. And, sadly, he's passed away now, but, I am very much indebted to his wisdom and support over the years. He was one of those really sort of creative, compassionate leaders who really challenged the way things were done. And I think probably in today's language, you'd almost call him a bit of a disruptor, which organizations are often looking for, people to say, why are we doing it like this? Why don't we do it differently? Let's think outside the box. But enormously supportive, and would always champion, especially young people coming into the MOD back in the day. So he was absolutely instrumental in the direction and the opportunities I had in terms of introducing me to people and projects and areas that I got involved in. But I think also more personally, family members. I mean, particularly, I come from a family of very strong women, I would argue. I think, we everyone in our family, that we're all working women, working parents who have constantly sort of gone to university, studied, done training courses. And I think probably my mother is the best example, having been so, sadly, as a single parent in similar circumstances to you, Bob. My father passed away at a young age. I had a very supportive childhood, though, living with grandparents, but my mother was very much focused on, right, I need to get a degree, I need to study, I need to get a job that's going to really allow me to be independent. Thankfully, she then met my father when I was 8, and then, that really helped to have that sort of family structure around. But her sort of tenacity and focus to keep everything going, being a mother, being a head of department in a state school, big department, managing all of the requirements whilst simultaneously always learning and developing and doing more, just as always. And to this day still provides me with, motivation and focus, which I call on as a working mum myself on many, many occasions. So there's a lot of, what would she do if she was in this situation, which I still use to this day.
Yeah, but, don't we all? Don't we all?
Absolutely. And friends too. I think if you've got a good network of friends around you, they are also your role models. I don't think I would be where I am today if it wasn't for those friends around me who I turn to almost daily for advice and guidance. So, it's very much a shared enterprise, I think, when you look at what it is that shaped and directed your decisions and career over time.
Absolutely. And obviously, as you said, from a psychology point of view, you have looked at lots of people. I mean, you've made a living out of studying people. And across a lot of the stuff you've done in government work, particularly, I guess, some of those have been pretty senior leaders. I'm just interested in not just those ones necessarily, but which leaders have impressed you the most and why?
So it's interesting. I think one of the things I've certainly learned over the years, reflecting on people who have been leaders to me, as in I've been, part of their sort of team and organization, are the ones who often are quite different from me in terms of my sort of traits and dispositions and behaviors. So I've, over a long period of time, where you're working on projects which, are taking sort of 6 months, a year plus, working with those who have had a really methodical, quite introverted reflection on things has been really good style to match with my own. And it really speaks to the kind of need for diversity in teams, that you want people who are different, who work in different ways, because you inspire each other and you work well together through those differences. So personally, I've always worked well where I've got somebody to sit down, reflect with, talk through, and know that I'm being heard and listened and empowered to then take on things that I feel are good for the group or team. I found it very difficult when you're working with people who are quite rigid, inflexible, have a very sort of set idea of how things should be, maybe quite dogmatic. I find those to be very, very difficult situations to be in. But away from sort of just personal experiences, in terms of people I've worked with, it really speaks to the fact that there is no, and I think actually General Petraeus was saying this in the last podcast, there is no one size fits all when it comes to good leadership. You've basically got to be aware of what you've got and be mindful of how best to use it in the context you're in. So you've got to take every situation, every team member, every organizational challenge, and think what's the best that we've got and how do we deploy it to get the outcome we're looking for. And I think when you see that, I think he was using the term judgment, when you see that flexibility to stop and think and listen, and at times maybe say, I think I might have this wrong, or I think I might be doing this a different way, that tends to not only lead to the best outcomes, but also tends to have the best effect on the people that you're working with to get you there.
Yeah, it's so key, isn't it? Understanding the people you've got around you, whether they're working directly for you or they're just in a kind of network that you can tap into that to get the best outcome. And I think also being self-aware enough to know that you probably almost certainly are not the person with all the answers ever. And leaning on other people to provide you with help, support, and get you to the best answer for the team is absolutely where it needs to be. Because if you try and do it yourself, then generally that's going to be a suboptimal outcome for sure.
Absolutely. So often it requires a dose of humility to say, I'm not sure I know how to do this. Let's sit down and talk about how we're going to make this happen. And I think where you see that humility and that openness in leadership, you really bring people on side. And of course, then you're opening yourself up to a whole range of possible ways forward, which is just much more creative and agile, and also presents the risks early. So you can, change direction if needs be. And, all of those things we know from research as well contributes to psychological safety in teams and organizations. So, so these are all the kind of useful and effective leadership traits that tend to bubble up to the surface in successful teams.
Yeah, it must be pretty challenging being in in any kind of leadership role with a bunch of psychologists working for you, though. That you're pretty conscious that you're spending your whole day being psychoanalyzed.
It can be a bit like that. And having been on both sides of the coin, so having both led a team of behavioural scientists and been led by one, it also speaks to the fact it's not always easy to walk the talk. You can talk this stuff sometimes, but when you're in there doing it, especially if you're under pressure and there are, high stakes involved, we all have flaws and we revert back to poor behaviours or take shortcuts or have biases. You've just got to be aware of them and sometimes hold your hand up and say, actually, I got that wrong and I'll try better next time.
Yeah, it's an interesting area to talk about, actually. I mean, how do you develop that? Because I can see completely the self-awareness side being a real challenge in that space when you're doing it professionally and you've got skin in the game yourself, because you have actually got to, as you say, walk the walk as well as talk the talk. Do you apply kind of techniques to yourself to self-test and quality control yourself in that space? What do you do?
Well, the only way to build self-awareness is to factor in time to actually reflect on what you've done and have a good series of loving critics around you who can give you an honest appraisal of what's going on, whether that's family members or friends that you trust their opinion, or people in the workplace who can say to you without feeling that they're going to be negative consequences, I really think you need to rethink that decision, or I really think you need to think about the way you spoke to that person, or are you really sure this is the right way to go? And that can be really challenging at times. And it's just as true for a parent role as it is a leadership role, when you think you've got the right way of doing this, and actually somebody says to you, actually, Mum, I'm not sure that's going to work. And you think, okay, I'm going to listen. So the active listening, the kind of park ego to one side and listen to what people are telling you. And if they are people who you trust and they know you well and they're giving you honest feedback, you need to take that feedback on board and make time to hear it as well and question the assumptions you're making about the situation you're in, because you don't have all the answers. And sometimes you are so busy trying to get yourself and the team across the line, you develop, sort of blind spots, which sometimes other people need to point out to you. So again, it comes back to that humility and openness and active listening to say, what am I going on? Because that radar just needs to keep sweeping. That's where your sort of social awareness, self-awareness and antennae is. You need to keep it out there, keep it checked and well calibrated so you're making good decisions.
And that makes great sense. Really good advice. And I'm going to come on in a while to talk a bit more about specific leadership stuff, because that's, I think, where we can get a lot from what we're trying to achieve together, and why you're kind of in this enterprise with me as well. But with everything you've done, if you look at what you've done professionally, and actually, obviously now as a mum of two, and with all that's occurred across your life, if you were looking back now and saying to school age Susie, what should you do? What sort of advice would you give yourself?
Yeah. Gosh, we don't have long enough in a podcast to say all the things I would probably want to go back and advise myself on. I would probably say, apart from anything, and it's slightly learnt this later on, more through university time, but just try everything, be courageous, and don't allow the scripts in your head or the social expectations of who you are or where you are limit the possibilities that you could experience and go on to achieve. And I think, this is slightly a trait sometimes with women, that we kind of say to ourselves, is this, I'll probably get here, but no further, or this is the right place for me. And that's a space I shouldn't venture into. And, incredibly unhelpful, obstructive thoughts, which prevent the kind of determination to say, I'll give it a go, and to have that courage to step forward into the arena and say, yeah, this might not work out, but I'm going to give it a go. And I think, certainly when I was at university, my mum always quoted Robert Browning to me, which was a great quote, which really got me through my finals, which was, man's reach should exceed his grasp, or what's a heaven for, which I think is just a lovely quote, which basically says, you've got to really reach as far as you can, or what's the point if you don't try and just go further than what's near and around you. And that's certainly something I try and instill in my children, which is, look far, go far, try things. When I was backpacking around Southeast Asia after university in the late 90s, we often sort of motivated each other by the I think it was a book that came out that said, feel the fear and do it anyway, which got us through many a skydive and a bungee jump when we was wandering through Australia and Thailand. And it's so true. It's that sense of just try it. I'd rather try something and reflect on it than never having known whether it would have opened your doors or brought experiences and opportunities that, now today, I'm really glad I did them.
And how's that going to feel as a parent when your kids start feeling the fear and doing it anyway?
Yeah, exactly. Well, clearly they're not allowed to do it, because it's really hard, because that these are, that sort of courageous step to try things is what life is all about. And it's how you learn about yourself and your relationships and what you want out of life. And, so that's a bit where, as a parent, you've just got to go forward into the world. And, you hope that you've given them enough love, support and common sense that they make good judgments, to use Patrice's word. You hope you give them the building blocks and the blueprint for judgment, so that when they come to make those decisions themselves, as a 17-year-old driving a car, or a 29-year-old who's about to propose, or somebody who's about to, pull on their kind of, combat fatigues and walk onto the battlefield, whatever the decision is, that they use the good judgment that you hope you gave them through your parenting.
Yeah, such good advice. So true. We didn't sort of prep this bit, but you've mentioned it a couple of times. You talked about glass ceilings and also being a woman, and that not necessarily some of the time stymieing ambition and things. How do you think that's changed in recent time, and how much more work do you think we've got to do in that space, particularly looking at the workplace?
Well, I think, interestingly, I was reflecting on this with my mother actually only yesterday. We were talking about, my impression is I came out of the university and into the workplace in the late 90s, early 2000s, with a real sense of, I'm a woman working in defence. Nothing's going to stop me. This is going to be great. I'm going to, be anything I want to be. And then you just hit hurdles. And I looking back on it now, as, a woman approaching 50, I think we hit a bit of a false summit where we thought that we were nearing the top and getting somewhere, and actually realizing once we got to that false summit that there was another summit ahead of us. I hope that we're not now looking at another false summit and there's another one, but I think there will always be challenges, and it does take a long time to change. And, as a social psychologist, it is the norms and the culture and the behaviors day to day which need to change to create better environments for men and women to have equal opportunities. And I think that's a real challenge. And I'm also a big advocate on not losing sight of one group when you're trying to empower another. And as a mother of a 15-year-old son, I'm very aware that we need to make sure that as we create opportunities and open doors and support the kind of the women and the sort of sisterhood, that we don't do that at the risk of losing the men and the boys who also need, rightly at times, especially as they're growing up and forming their identity, support and understanding as well. I have a boy and a girl, so I really, look at the balance of this. I'm desperate for my daughter to go out and be everything she wants to be. And I am also desperate that my son feels that this is a world where he too can thrive and survive and shine, and be all the things he wants to be too. So it's a very, very interesting time.
Yeah, I think that's true. And I mean, interestingly, from the male point of view, looking at the workplace in particular, I mean, I think having seen huge change over 4 decades of work for me, a bit longer than you, in Air Force times when we were some extraordinary stuff, and we used to lock people up for being gay, throw them out of the military, and they were literally imprisoned, and women weren't allowed to do pretty much anything, really. I mean, there are a huge amount of roles they couldn't do, to now being in the space where obviously it's completely different, to then going to the commercial world where you see, I mean, Deloitte was a great example of this, where you've got a very, very vibrant, very young, very diverse workforce. And actually what you get from being part of that is the genuine value of all of the pieces of that. And it is all of the pieces of that. It's as you say, it's not about right now we're going to only play with these particular pieces. We're actually, we need to put them all together and use the whole jigsaw, if you like, because then you get the best effect and you get a complete picture if you continue the jigsaw analogy. So I think that's such an important thing. And I do think we I agree with you. I think we're getting better, but we've still got a way to go.
I mean, huge leaps have been made. I would not, if my daughter was growing up, in the workplace 25 years ago, I'd be really worried. And I feel better that the world is a better place for her. But at the same time, the worst thing that can happen is complacency, a sense of somehow we've done it. Everything's fine now. We're just going to put this veneer of kind of social equality over something where really it isn't equal. And I think we saw this with the Black Lives Matter movement, that it was this kind of cry of this. You can talk about equality, but when it comes to it, what are people doing? How are they behaving day to day to one another? Is it really, you look at the gender pay gap, where are these things still needing our attention? And we just got to keep calling that out, I think, where we see it. And that comes down to all of us to do that.
Yeah. No, I totally agree. Fascinating, and something we for sure could debate for longer, and probably will come back to at some point in the future as well, I think, because in the world of leadership, it's such an important facet. I think being, whether you're a man leading a team or a woman leading a team, there are different considerations and similar considerations as well that you need to bring to bear in that. Can't afford to ignore those sorts of things. I think it's really important to understand the kind of full dynamic. Looking specifically at some leadership stuff, though, with all the research and the training work you've done, what are the leadership traits that you think are the most important for not just for leaders, but also actually for followers?
Well, it's interesting, really, because I think part of the language around leadership is slightly flawed. And I say that because I think this sort of brings us on to where I think we should be looking with leadership. And it's different, I think, to how traditional approaches go about this. We get a bit fixated on traits. What are you doing? What do you do, Bob, that makes you a good leader? What does Jane do that makes her a good CEO? And we become very, what we call reductionist. We look at the individual and what they've got or haven't got that makes them great leaders. And we kind of lose sight of the followership. You can't lead if people aren't following. And we forget sometimes that actually a lot of the strength of leadership is in the interpersonal dynamic between the leaders and the people who follow and the people that those leaders are motivating. So the work that I do and where I've seen some real success, and bearing in mind a lot of my work to date has been really in the sort of interpersonal influence, diplomatic skills of working with people in quite high levels across the different cultures, is recognizing first of all, the self-awareness to know what you've got. Yeah. What are my leadership traits? What's my personality? What's my strengths? Recognizing that, but saying, what am I going to do with it? And this is the sort of models of what's often called emotional intelligence, which I think people probably have a sort of misunderstanding of that term. But emotional intelligence is effectively about the interpersonal skill of using what you've got well. So it's not a thing you've got. It's not a noun. It's a verb. It's the doing of leadership that's really important. It's the behaviours and the adaptation and the skill of reading the people in the room, thinking about what's going on, and being agile enough to adjust your style to deliver effect. And some really good research has been carried out over the past, probably about the last 15 years, which is less about leadership as a kind of individual reductive sort of skill. Do I have it or not? And more about identity leadership, which is about not me, not I, but us, we as the team, and how leaders operate as effectively representatives of the identity of the teams that they lead and the people that follow. So, that requires, breaking it down at the practical level, lots of skills around being self-aware. Do I know what I do and how it comes across, who I am, the different identities I hold? Who am I leading? Who are my followers? Do I know them? What are we trying to achieve? What constitutes us as a team? Like, what's our purpose and our mission and our focus? And how do we get there together? So, how do you mobilize change and motivation through people and lead from within rather than sort of dictate and drive from the outside, which I think maybe more traditional leadership models can sometimes sort of fall victim to.
Yeah, really, really interesting and powerful stuff. I mean, I've not forgotten actually a conversation we had ages ago now, where we talked about psychometrics and the fact that corporates, and I mean, lots and lots of people beyond corporates use psychometric tests for all sorts of purposes, and quite often they're these 4-box quadrant psychometric tests. And I can still remember you saying that you think that that basic model of having 4 boxes is a bit flawed. Because, and I use this quite a lot in some of the work that I do, actually, where I talk to people about be careful, because it's all very well understanding yourself in terms of where you fit in that and understanding other people. And I think it is helpful. But your comment to me was it gives you an excuse for the behavior you potentially exhibit. Yeah. And just because I am a driver, that's the behavior I'm going to exhibit because it's, I've been told I'm one, therefore I am one.
And that's absolutely. And I've seen that where people have been holding their psychometric saying, look, I'm a particular color or type or animal or whatever it might be. Therefore, this is how I am. And it kind of solidifies their type and gives them an excuse for not being adaptable and agile and not being, not being terribly self-aware. So psychometrics are the best tools when you're using it to build self-awareness. What are my typical preferences? Which are the typical behaviors I show? But that's step one. Step two is, and who am I trying to influence? What outcomes am I trying to achieve? And in which context? Am I a military officer making decisions? Am I a financial advisor? Am I a parent? Am I, a teacher in a classroom? Understanding the social context changes all of these ways. Being an extrovert in these contexts means different things depending on who you're working with and in which context you're carrying out that work. So they can sometimes can look like nice shiny outcomes to help teams along, but they are the first step in a process of just building awareness that allows people to perform better, but they need to use it in the right way. So very, very helpful, but use appropriately.
Don't use it as a badge. Use it as a tool. Yeah, I'm totally with you. I think that makes absolute
self-learning.
Yeah. It's great. And I say it's such a common thing. And I think it is really important because definitely one of the pluses of those kind of tools is, and for me personally, I know it's really helped me in terms of understanding other people better. Because, being as I am, I'm a pretty extrovert, outgoing, quite dominant individual. To be in a position where I know that to get the best from the people in the team, I need to recognize the kind of traits of the people that aren't like me, and then the sort of things that will potentially push their buttons and get them to to function. So, I think that's certainly the way I try and apply that knowledge, and hope to get other people to do similar now.
Can be great because people have real blind spots about how they come across, and good psychometrics, well validated tools. There's a lot of stuff you could just download off the internet, which have big question marks, but well validated, licensed products can be great at letting you see your blind spots. And I always encourage people, if I'm coaching or using the psychometrics, to say to them, take it home, show it to your partner, your parents, your children, get their take on it, have a look at yourself through their eyes. And, because we are always a product of the people we're interacting with. Extroversion only makes sense when you're being extroverted with or to someone. So, these things aren't fixed, static descriptors of human behavior. They're real, and they move with people, and they are determined and defined by different social interactions and different contexts. Being extroverted in quiet times in the office looks different from being extroverted during times of high pressure and crisis. And so we've got to recognize these psychological terms in their social context. And as a social psychologist, that's fundamentally the driver of the work. I think we've overlooked an important part of the leadership puzzle. Being quite Western-centric, quite reductive. Our psychology is all about people and individuals. That's the nature of being, Western European or very much the dominance of the United States in psychology. But it's made us miss a trick in understanding what leadership is about, and we've overlooked an important part of the kind of identity and social interaction aspects that are fundamental to good leadership qualities.
Totally. And interestingly, when I was doing a lot of crisis management work, we talked a lot about different changes in behavior. So, if you're the chief exec or the C anything of a company, your behavior in normal times will be something, and probably you may well be absolutely brilliant around the executive table or the board table, and very, very collaborative and everything else. But when you actually get into a crunch moment, you have to recognize, whether you're the leader or indeed part of the team, that your behavior will change. It inevitably
absolutely.
changes. And and knowing that, and knowing the kind of traits you potentially have under pressure, as well as the ones you've got in normal behavior, I think is hugely valuable if you've got that kind of insight into yourself, because it can make such a difference when the chips are down.
Absolutely. And one thing I always encourage individuals and teams to do is to not just recognize how they behave in different contexts, but recognizing the different social groups that influence them. So we have different norms that shape our behavior. We have behaviors that are suitable when we're at home with family, and we're sort of conforming to those expectations and social roles. And they are very different from when we're, playing football, on a Saturday morning, or out at the theatre with friends, or in the workplace. So, attuning people to what are the social and organizational norms that you are abiding by, that's shaping your behavior. And equally, some of them can be quite unhealthy. So within a team, what are the norms that are meaning that people aren't speaking up, or people are afraid of the consequences, or people can't show emotion? So being alive to the kind of unwritten rules and regulations and punishments and rewards that go on in teams also helps us understand how different behaviors come to the fore in different ways. So that broader look at the individual in their group is a really, really helpful lens to diagnose where some of the opportunities and some of the problems lie.
Yeah, but we touched on this earlier, but I think before we move on to something else, it's worth diving into it a bit. Social media and the impact of the world as it is now, particularly on youngsters joining the workplace, but not just youngsters by any means. I think I see huge changes now in the way people interact. I mean, I've literally sat with my wife in a restaurant looking across the table at, across the room at people who are sat there, and they're not talking at all. They're just they're on the phones, and they stay on the phones. In some instances, we watched it once for literally the entire meal. I don't think these people said 2 words to each other the entire time. And I see that in work as well, where you've got people who are much over-consumed by that, and it's changing their character. It's changing certainly the amount of emotional intelligence that they have, the social skills that they have, in their ability to actually talk to other people in social settings, or indeed in work settings. And when I do workshops and things, we talk about networking some of the time. Some people find that terribly difficult because it's just not in their skill set. They find that they're very uncomfortable if they're put in a room full of people and expected to chat to them, because it's just not something they've got used to doing. But I'd be really interested in your much more professional, much more educated and academic take on some of this than mine, which is just perceptions.
Well, it's interesting. I mean, there's lots of really interesting research that's being done on this, especially at Bath University, actually, is a place that's doing all this. But, my take on it is that I see it, and again, I kind of put this with a parent head on, watching my children use social media. And I'm a big advocate of technology. I think it's a great enabler. And my husband and I often check ourselves in case we're falling down the kind of, kids these days always on their phones, because I think, their lives do involve phones and technology, and they always will, and that will grow. So we have to be alive to it and understand it, and understand how their world is different from ours. It's not going to be like it was in the late 90s. Their lives, their attention is being called for in different ways. But it also reflects the fact that we have many different social identities. You have, hopefully most people have a good selection of sort of 7, 8, 9, 10 different social identities, and we often move through them in the real world. And so we get to be the mum, the CEO, the consultant, the football player, the Spanish speaker in those different worlds. Social media has allowed us to be many things simultaneously. So you could be sat at work and also be talking to your, film club group at the same time. And so in many ways, the technology has just allowed us to be all the things we already were, but do them simultaneously. But that makes for a very, very busy and distracted social world. And you're right. The downside of that is that on the basis that social media is about the attention economy and competing for our attention against other competitors, people want our attention 24/7. And so we have to learn the ways and the strategies to put boundaries in place so that we recognize what we are needed for in the moment, and we give our attention to that. So as a parent, I have to consciously, but make sure I put my phone away, and when my children are around, that I am talking to them and I'm holding their eye contact, and I'm not, looking at my phone and having a conversation without looking up. I'm quite fortunate and feel quite lucky that, often in my jobs in the MOD, we're not allowed to bring phones in anyway. And I like that. I like the fact that you can focus on the day job and do one thing well and not feel that overload, because, we can carry so much information, but our cognitive bandwidth is finite, and, things will start to degrade if we're trying to do too many things at once. And research shows that in terms of productivity, doing one thing well and then moving on to the next one is the best way to move through things. So I think there's pros and cons. I think young people will be better at maintaining simultaneous senses of life and identity, which we might not be able to do. And therefore they might be able to speed through things faster, cut through content, connect, build networks. But the downside of that is that it is hugely cognitively demanding and has social consequences, because of course, when you're on your phone, you're not attending to that person who's sitting next to you trying to get your attention. So we'll get there. I'm a big believer that we'll get there, but I think it is down to organizations, parents, institutions to clarify some of these rules about how these things are handled in the workplace, in the home, at school.
Just interesting, the internet native versus internet immigrants thing, that's for sure. Yeah. I mean, my wife's niece, oldest of her nieces, who's just become a teenager, I mean, her ability to do stuff, it just jaw-dropping on the phone.
Absolutely. And I find it's a real, there's a real strength there. I'll ask my children to do things because they can do it faster. They know their way around it. They're much more sort of technically agile. And that's a great thing. But the downside of it as well is that, there's a lot of emotional burden, cognitive demand that comes with a digital life, living both online and offline, that, can also be really psychologically detrimental. And so getting the balance right is key. But it's certainly not abandoning one to the other. It's about working out, again, how do you get that balance right between the two to get the best of both worlds?
Totally. I was reading something not that long ago, actually, about YouTube. It wasn't a shot at YouTube. I think it was just using it as an example where their whole model is designed now to try and seduce you to stay on the platform.
Absolutely.
So, that's why they flow from one video to the next video, and they'll know, because they're intelligently looking at this in terms of what kind of content you look at, that they'll give you something that's interesting. And understanding how to navigate that is clearly going to become increasingly important. And I think not just navigate it from the point of view of avoiding that become a problem, actually from a leadership point of view in any world, how do we leverage that? How do we use that to our advantage because at the end of the day, information advantage is clearly very, very useful to you. And if you can get the best out of that, it's got to be a great place to be.
Yeah.
Switching tack a little bit, we founded Leading for Life together back in 2019, unbelievably, and neatly timed just for COVID to come in and stop us doing some of the things we'd originally talked about doing. But that was based on a sort of shared interest in leadership, desire to help others develop their own leadership skills. And my own side of that was very much based on what I'd seen in transition from the military to the private sector, the relative challenges some of the time in the corporate world around leadership development, where it's not often a priority and it's not delivered potentially as effectively as it might be by a lot of organizations, because they're quite understandably focused on business skills, not on leadership skills. But could I just ask you to take a view on what you saw from this, and what attracted you to kind of co-founding the company in the first place?
Yeah, well, I think it comes back to that point I was making about having worked as a psychologist for a long time now. Leadership's a really popular area, and especially working as a psychologist in the MOD, you come across people who've got all sorts of models and approaches, and you see and experience different leadership models. But time and time again, I found that it was missing a really important part of the puzzle. And it was so focused on the individual, their strengths, their dispositions, what their psychometric says, that they weren't understanding some really fundamental things that we know about identity, groups, and social influence. And so, there's, and I've yet to, I think it's one other commercial psychologist, contracting psychologist I've talked to who is operating with a social lens on what they're looking at. Because, if you look at some of the great sort of leaders of our time, we can delve into their psyche and try and understand them as an individual. But if we pull out a bit and look at how they communicate, how they connect to people, how they shape a sense of us and a sense of common goal and sort of shared direction, there's some really good stuff there that we can learn about. And there's some great work by Alex Haslam and Stephen Reicher and Michael Plato, but they've, over the last few years, have done some excellent work on identity leadership, which looks at the way in which leaders create a sense of us, form and embed it and craft it so that teams are hugely motivated. And, they give examples of, there's a great one actually Alex Haslam gave during COVID, which was a sort of communication from the Australian government around COVID, quite an old-fashioned leadership model of, this is what you need to do, wash your hands, stand 1.5 meters apart from each other, directive, content-based leadership of, you must do this, these are your orders, you need to follow them. And he compared it with the New Zealand government, whose approach was much more about identity leadership. It was much more about, let's work on this together. Let's do our bit to unite against COVID. And it used the Maori saying, kia kaha, which means stay strong. And it did it from a point of view of, who are we as a people and what are we trying to achieve? And the impact on the behaviours in the two different countries was really interesting, because one was about us and doing it together. And one was about, we're telling you how to do it. And if you look at leadership speeches, so you look at someone like Donald Trump's speeches versus Barack Obama's speeches, Donald Trump's speeches are full of I, me. It's all about him. Now, it's not to say that he does not have some really significant charismatic pulls that mean that people follow him. But in terms of good, enduring leadership, where you see in speeches the terms around us and we and doing it together, like you do in Barack Obama's speeches and Biden's speeches, you see a lot more of this identity leadership. And I just think that's something that we have still got to learn in the workplace. I see bits of it, and it's more where people are intuitively picking it up rather than people are saying to them, look, you're missing a trick here. Let's look at this from an identity point of view. So when we came together and started talking about leadership, and I do think the military do this well, actually. I think there are some good examples of where identity leadership is really encapsulated in military leadership, where you see that being done well. There is a lot to learn and a lot that can be shared into the commercial sector.
Yeah, it's interesting, and you'll have seen it. It's one of the things I talked about with David Petraeus about, I think, misconceptions of military leadership.
Yeah,
that people look at it and tend to think it's very authoritarian, and the reality is, yes, there's a place for that, but that's by no means the norm, or indeed the kind of acceptable standard of it these days. I think it has to be much broader than that and better than that if you're going to take the people with you. So no, I'm completely with you. I think it's really key aspect of it. Having joked earlier on about psychologists working for people and being psychoanalyzed, I'm about to kind of put myself in the hot seat here because, as you know, I mean, I set the podcast up to share a range of leadership thoughts, not only mine and yours for sure. On occasion, we'll do this more than once, but also those of the guests that I have and that we have on the podcast. You've got a vast amount of experience of this in terms of psychoanalyzing people face to face and remotely. I'm just really interested in you've listened to what I've done so far and kind of what you think of it. What do you think's valuable? Where do you think we can take it? And what would be most use to the listeners?
Well, I think the there's a huge amount of value in getting people to reflect. Especially when you've had a really sort of diverse career in the sense of lots of different challenging experiences. Yours. Talking to General Petraeus last week. There's so much that can be gleaned from the self-reflection that comes from somebody looking at their career to date, because that self-awareness often doesn't come in the moment. It comes, it's a sort of wisdom that forms years down the line when you can put those experiences into context and say, why did I do it like that? Or why did that work? And I think, the value of the stories that you're sharing is that it gives people that incentive to reflect on their own experiences and learn from other people's, which is really, really valuable. I think there is always a danger, and I this is something I sort of often preach to the Foreign Office, and I have done in the MOD, which is, you bring in people and you say, this is leadership. I did it like this when I was ambassador in Beijing, when I was, commanding this, forward operating base and wherever. There's always a danger that people think that that's the model that they have to go for, that that's the way they have to do it, that there is a kind of a right way and a wrong way to do it. And hopefully, and as I've heard certainly so far, that the lesson learned is that was the way I did it. That's not necessarily going to work for everybody every time. So the value of this is that it really tells people that it's the skills of being reflective and self-aware about yourself, not trying to match and copy other people's leadership styles that's going to get you where you want to be. I think it's always an interesting challenge, I think, when you work with senior leaders, and I've certainly seen this working with senior leaders in my time, is that if you've done something well for many, many years, you get to a point, and I know we've talked about this briefly before, where you become what we call unconsciously competent. You don't know kind of really how you do it. You just know you do it. You've been doing it for so long. You've been in so many different scenarios that you can read them quickly and you can process that information and form very quick judgments. And so sometimes these myths can grow around certain senior leaders or experts just having this amazing kind of X factor that means that they can just be great. And this is where the sort of myth that, great leaders are sort of born and not made, or somehow somebody's got that sort of gift. And I always find that really frustrating as somebody who works in learning and development, because if that was the case, there'd be no point trying to help develop people's leadership skills, because either you got it or you haven't. And that's absolutely not the case. Everybody starts on that kind of shaky, wobbly bicycle ride where they've taken their stabilizers off and they've got to cycle in a straight line. And, I see it when I work with students, that you go through this progressive point from being unconsciously incompetent, like, I don't know, I can't do it, to being consciously incompetent, which, if anyone's tried to learn a new skill, it's that point where you think, this is really hard. I don't know what I'm doing. I'm getting it wrong. I'm dropping the ball quite often. But you push through that and you keep trying and you keep practicing, and you get to the point where you become much more competent, but you're having to think hard about it. But you keep going and keep going. You get to the point where sort of muscle memory and learning and reflection takes place, where you don't need to give it so much thought. And that point of being unconsciously competent is a great place to be, but not everybody gets there. And a lot of people give up on the way. And I think knowing that journey is there, and talking to people like you, talking to people like General Petraeus, other senior leaders, to get them to reflect back on, when was it hard? When did you have to really think about this? When did the failures occur? What did you do with them? Gives a lot of people hope that they too can work through those difficult times, and that there is no such thing as this kind of one size fits all born to lead. It is a much longer, more enduring process of learning and reflecting and developing.
The competence ladder is such a key thing, isn't it? I mean, the analogy I often use with people about that is driving. Because, so often, I think it works really well because people often talk about, flying, and is it difficult to fly when you're talking to pilots, and you go, well, yeah, initially, sure, there's lots to learn, there's an awful lot going on, and you have to think about kind of everything you're doing. But the analogy with a car is very clear. If you're a car driver and you've been driving for, I don't know, 20 years or something, or probably less than that, well before you get to that 20-year point, you will have got to the point of unconscious competence. You don't think about driving the car. You'll just get in the car and drive it. And you'll hopefully, in the most part, drive it well. And you're not thinking about any aspect of that in terms of the maneuvers you're making, the switch selections you're making, or all the rest of it. You're just doing it. And that was very true, certainly in the flying game as well. And I think it's true for a lot of aspects of any skilled thing. So I totally agree. I think interestingly as well on the broader sort of topic of leadership in general. I mean, I put a LinkedIn post up about this a while ago about books, and it generated some really interesting discussion because it was which books do you think are great, and what's your favourite, and it actually generated a few for me that I thought, well, great, I'll go and read those because I haven't read them. But the other interesting aspect of it was a sort of side debate about books. But in fact, I think I got a comment on the post saying use the books for propping open the office door so you can see the team outside and talk to them more.
Right.
And which I was meant partly in jest and was partly a bit of a challenge to the post. But the reality is, of course, that there are people out there who think that you can read a book and suddenly you've cracked the problem, and it isn't like that. And I think to the point about founding this, Leading for Life and doing what we do, one of the things I think that is great about, from my perspective of what we do, is the fact that you've got me who've spent a long time doing military stuff and corporate stuff in leadership roles, and with therefore a lot of experience of that. You've similarly got a fair bit of experience of actually leading people, but you've also got all the piece that I haven't got, which is all that academic knowledge and the kind of deep research base that goes with it and underpins an awful lot of some of the things that I will say with my unconsciously competent view that you can actually turn around and explain and justify in research terms. And I think that's such a powerful thing that we can potentially bring to this.
Absolutely. And I think that's, it's sometimes great to hear how people led, but if you can't repeat it and it's not like empirically helpful, i.e. you can't train it to future leaders, it's just a story. What you want is something that you can think about and sort of say, how can I learn from this and use it for my own success, my team's success, to get the outcomes I want? And so, I'm a big advocate of listen to the stories and the experience and find the bits where it chimes with the science of leadership and harness those. That's where I think real value can be given to teams.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, I think the story aspect is really useful because it brings it to life with real examples. But yeah, you're right. It's got to be something that is kind of relevant and useful. I mean, I quite often use military stories to corporate audiences because they are kind of more extreme than probably they're going to find in the corporate setting, but it kind of proves the relevance of the point. Delegation is a very good one, actually, in that I talk quite regularly about that kind of thing. And I think it's definitely got some value to throw in there. I mean, interestingly, I found, back to the podcast, one of the things I found about doing this is it's increased my own self-reflection and my own, as I've gone back, particularly in some of the personal story stuff. I mean, I've definitely had to think a bit harder about some of that than I perhaps have done previously. And it's, I was amused. I spent a bit of time listening to Stephen Bartlett's Diary of a CEO podcast, and he talks often about his therapy for him. And I can see why he says that. I absolutely can see why he says that. I think it's an interesting interesting area.
Well, a lot of the reflection, a lot of things that we learn about ourselves come about through telling it as a story and making sense of it. And I've certainly found this in my PhD research when I'm getting, refugees to tell me the story of their arrival. The telling of the story is actually quite therapeutic because it's helping to make connections and make sense of what happened and put it into a meaningful context, which in and of itself is really helpful in terms of our narrative of who we are and where we've come from and where we're going. We need to have that sense of kind of continuity and purpose. And that comes through telling stories. Stories are incredibly powerful in that way. And if we can also learn from them to help other people, better.
No, totally agree. You touched on myths earlier on. Are there any other leadership myths out there that you feel are still being purported that are unhelpful?
I think it's changing, thankfully. I still think that there is a sort of cultural bias towards focusing on the individual and overlooking the team or the context or the situation. So, there's a thing in psychology, without getting too geeky about it, called the fundamental attribution error, which means we have a tendency to overly attribute success or failure to an individual. And we fail to sort of zoom out and look at the other driving factors. So, if something goes well for somebody, we'll tend to say it's because they were competent or they had a good personality, or, people like that, do well in situations like this. And I think sometimes we see that and we reward it. So if teams do well, the leader gets the reward, the one person, who kind of stands up and sort of represents the team. So I think that's led to an unhelpful sort of Western centric bias of thinking that it's all down to the individual, and a failure to see the systems and the people around them that make it happen. I think good leaders recognize that, and they recognize that they are, it's a sort of greater than the sum of its parts. It's all the people pulling together to deliver it. They might have set the course and given the motivation and the vision and the goal, but you can't do it without the followers, without the people to make it happen. But, sadly, I think there's probably quite a lot of ego that gets in the way. There's probably quite a lot of a sort of sense of, I and me and what did I do and deliver, which to this day in interviews, people are encouraged to, what did you do to make that happen? How did you deliver the outcome? I know a lot of people who find that really uncomfortable because they're like, well, I was in a team. I couldn't have done, but what we want to hear is you. We want to hear about your competence and your greatness and your skill. But, we're social animals. We very rarely is one person ever the sole creator or deliverer of these outcomes. And so, I think leadership can fall victim to that sometimes. And that can put a huge amount of pressure and stress on leaders to feel that they are carrying and responsible for everything, as opposed to thinking, what's the team around me and how can I use them effectively to delegate, to share some of the responsibility, to get advice, which, is certainly going to help them in terms of their own mental health and well-being when, the stakes are high and the pressure's on.
Yeah, it's really, to your point about interviews, I mean, I can vividly remember that from when I was leaving the military, just going out to the corporate world, because that was absolutely, to your point, that was absolutely the emphasis. Well, what have you done? And so, well, I mean, we did this stuff. No, not we. What is it? And they're pushing you to go for the, I did this, I did that. And the reality is, there's very few things in my career that, apart from when I was in the cockpit on my own kind of thing, that I can say I did that. The majority of it was we did that. When I was commanding a squadron, whether I was commanding a station, whether I was running a base in Afghanistan. These are massive team endeavors where you're bringing the team together to make it work. I don't think we ever, certainly I didn't ever think about that as an individual competence. That I mean, obviously there is an element of it that's that clearly, but it's not something that I think we tended to think about at all in that space.
And of course, not all cultures think like that. And I think that's where, if you're looking at leadership operating globally, you need to understand that, many of our views around leadership and effectiveness in the workplace are still very Western centric, and we need to make sure that they are culturally appropriate, and that the things that we assume are just natural about human behavior, we don't overgeneralize those to different cultures and contexts where they just, it does not work like that. Different things are driving and influencing people in different ways. We have to be very alive to those social and cultural differences.
Yeah, I totally agree. And even actually in places where things have evolved and changed a lot, there are big cultural differences, most definitely, in terms of social norms across the whole spectrum of the way you conduct yourself and everything else. I think in terms of, I mean, classic, go Middle Eastern culture. If you jump straight into business, that's a really, really rude.
Yeah.
You've got to be having a conversation and a bit of chit chat and a cup of tea.
Yeah, some real just professional courtesies that people need to be aware of. But yeah, there's a little bit of that, I think, in business, but there's a lot more, and there's again myths around that as well, which have been purported, which again, just aren't helpful or aren't credible. That we know from cross-cultural psychology have sort of run away with themselves in the business speak, that it's like, oh, well, China's like this and the US is like this. And what you end up finding is you end up, really kind of creating these sort of polar opposites in cultural type. And it's not that straightforward. You'll be more nuanced about understanding the culture, the business you're working with, the shared goals, the vision. So yeah. there's a lot to be learned on that side as well.
Yeah, nuance is a good word in that space, that's for sure, I think. Training and development. I mean, obviously, that's what you're, to some extent, doing a lot of now with, as you alluded to, with government. What do you think in the leadership space is the most valuable thing for leaders? Where have you seen the best success in terms of this? Because I'll situate the question a little bit in that I'm not sure leadership is one of these things that you train people to be leaders. You offer them tips, tools, ideas, thoughts, experiences, mentoring. But there's obviously a tendency to, right, we'll do a workshop and we're better because we've done the workshop. And hopefully that gives you some tools and tips and things like that as well. But what's your thought? What works well?
Yeah, I agree. I think it's, you can't sort of teaching leadership as if it's sort of a one-dimensional thing, and it really isn't. It's often the outcome of some just really good learning and development in many other spaces. Going back to my point about self-awareness, almost in any role where people are interacting and influencing others, self-awareness is absolutely the first step. We tend to assume that we give people skills to do things to other people, to motivate other people, to lead, to change, to communicate, as if somehow our being present in that room has no bearing on the audience or the message or anything else. And so starting with the kind of, okay, who are you and what influence do you have when you walk into a room? How do you know where your strengths and weaknesses are? What are the different identities that you carry when you go on that overseas trip or that boardroom meeting? Who are you when you meet that person in the boardroom? Getting people to really think much more like that, I think, is absolutely essential. And a lot of those skills around the kind of emotional intelligence of understanding interpersonal influence, which, we teach it slightly in a kind of airport book style of do this and then say this, and then, as if there's a formula to it, which just leads to really sort of blundering, slightly cringeful ways of people trying to influence and build relationships with people and secure deals and negotiate trade outcomes. And it's really painful to watch. So getting people to be much more reflective, much greater humility, greater compassion and empathy for the people they're working with, active listening. There's some real building block skills there, which if you can get those right, then you put the person in the right place in the organization and they should shine because they're bringing all that with them. But, if those fundamental building blocks aren't looked at and critically and in a really supportive way, then that individual's going to really struggle in the role wherever they are in the organization. So, one of the things I always do with people is I get them to map their sort of social identities and the social identities of other people in their world, just to see how they come together in terms of the different things you are to different people, to make people understand that we're not these one-dimensional characters who are one thing to everybody. We're lots of things to lots of people. And once you draw people's attention to that, people have much more agility to kind of flex their style and read people and respond well to people. And once you can break people out of these kind of expectations and assumptions and get them to flex, you see some much better outcomes in terms of their performance and their interpersonal skills in particular.
Really interesting thoughts. I mean, for me, the bit that resonated immediately with what you said is that kind of when you walk into the room, what kind of atmosphere do you create? Because I've seen too many people, particularly military, but corporate as well, who speak first and then listen and speak in a way that is, this is what we're going to do. Now, What do you think? And if your leadership style is such that you're relatively dominant, then of course you're going to get no response back.
Absolutely.
And I was doing a guesting on another podcast recently, actually, where I was asked for my top tip, and it said you've got 2 ears and 1 mouth, and you should use them in proportion and then in that order. Because I think actually, if you listen twice as much as you talk, and you listen first and then you talk, that's got to be a great way to go.
Absolutely. And there's that great quote, isn't there, by Stephen Covey, or Covey, I don't quite know how to pronounce his surname. I can't remember which chapter is in his book, which says, this is my mantra, which I think I'm going to get printed on a t-shirt, which is seek first to understand, then be understood.
Yeah, absolutely.
Which is, absolutely critical. And people don't do that enough because they think they've got the answer, or they think they're in a position of power, and therefore their word goes, and they're not really getting the lie of the land. They're not seeing things from different perspectives, all of which would give them a strategic advantage. But very rarely will they seek it when they're in that sort of quite sort of more egocentric state.
I have to say that Stephen Covey's 7 Habits of Highly Effective People. I mean, I often say to people, if you read one book, that's the book.
Yeah, it's
I
a
think
fantastic
that
book.
is amazing book.
Yeah.
Really,
Yeah.
really useful. And just in terms of thinking about not just leadership stuff and not just work stuff, I mean, all sorts of aspects of life. I think it's really, really helpful.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Hey, we're getting to the end, Susie. Just I'm going to go back and be back to the personal bit. What's the most memorable event of your career so far?
Gosh. So there's been lots of really interesting memorable bits. I think probably when I did my master's at London School of Economics, and I was very fortunate that I got to go out to Iraq within less than a month of the formal end of operations to go and collect data for my dissertation. Can't imagine what the insurance was on that to try and get me out there, but I got to go out to, it was really memorable and influential because I got to go out to Al Amara, to Maysan province, and stay in Simic House, which was where we were stationed with some Royal Marines prior to going out. And I wanted to run focus groups. I wanted to go out and talk to the locals and trial some qualitative psychological methods to see if we can understand what happens to communities after the formal cessation of operations, and explore how people felt with British forces and various others, allied forces being in the region. And it was such an amazing experience because the people I met were just incredible. You know, the local Iraqis were so friendly and welcoming and supportive, despite the fact that we had sort of 12 Royal Marine close protection people with us, which didn't make some of the kind of dynamics of focus groups that easy. But it was such an incredible opportunity to go out there with colleagues and have those conversations. And very, very sad in the sense that the conclusions were there is a huge vacuum being left and these people don't know what's coming next. And they are in limbo. They're in what you call this period of liminality. They're sort of untethered. They're not sure what's happening. And I think the lessons learned from that is that we didn't know what was going to come next. And then the interesting thing was that just a year after that, my brother was in the 1st Battalion PWRR and was based in Simic House, exactly the same building a year later, enduring what became the kind of longest defensive stance since World War II, of enduring day after day, mortaring gunfire as the Muqtada al-Sadr, I think it was the kind of Mahdi army, had swept through southern Iraq and had recruited these very people who I'd been talking to in coffee shops and cafes only 12 months earlier, and had been swept up by the kind of the charisma and ideology and leadership of Muqtada al-Sadr, and were firing upon British troops in Simic House, exact building where we were. And I found that sense of, you know, those people, they hadn't changed in terms of their personality, or what had happened is that the social context had shifted radically, and the absence of having some meaningful purpose in their life meant that they were much more vulnerable to being effectively radicalized in terms of their behavior by this sort of extremist ideology. And it really shifted my way of seeing this sort of asymmetric conflict and the motivation of people and where we need to be looking. And, you know, thankfully my brother came home unscathed. You know, many of his colleagues didn't, but it was a very, very interesting and formative experience of understanding how the social context can shift the dynamics and the behaviors of the people that you are trying to support or work alongside. And that's something that really that stays with me today.
And very quickly as well, that's for sure.
Absolutely.
Hey, look, the very last question, which I ask everybody just because I think it's a fun question, but what's the most difficult question you've ever been asked?
Well, bear in mind I have children, so I get about 1 million questions thrown at me through every day, many of which I think the most, there isn't a particular question which I thought this is the most difficult question. I think the most difficult questions in general are ones where people are asking you questions, not because they want the answer, but because they want reassurance or hope or some sense of certainty. And I think as a parent, sometimes you can be asked questions where, you know, your child's looking at you as if to say, tell me it's going to be okay, or what's going to happen, or where are we going? And you're thinking, I'm not sure. I can't provide you with the certainty you want. And I've experienced that not just as a parent, but I've experienced it working with refugees who look at you and ask you questions like, can you help me? Can you get us out of here? Can the British Embassy help? And you can't change fundamentally the psychology or fabric of their life, and they're in really difficult circumstances, and you feel a bit hopeless. But you've also got to recognize that you can't provide all the answers all the time, but you can support people and listen. And that goes a long way to at least trying to provide them with some help that they may need, whether it's there as a psychologist doing some research, or as a parent or a friend.
It's a really interesting answer. And I think actually one of the things that, again, I look back on the military time for this, is thinking about what might I be asked under those circumstances, and how might I handle that, is, I think, really important. I mean, particularly with bereavements and things like that, then I think it's an area you've got to turn around. You know, classic, you can't make it any better, but you can certainly make it worse by some kind of careless throwaway remark, you know. So, I mean, actually, it is definitely an area that is worth focusing on if you're doing that kind of thing, for sure.
Absolutely. And then asking people to answer their question. I mean, this is the facilitator's greatest gift, isn't it? You get the difficult question in a team workshop or a training session. People look to you to provide the answers, and you say, that's a really interesting question. What do people in the room think?
Absolutely.
And, you know, often it's good to redirect and listen to other perspectives in the room. So I think, again, a bit of humility, that even if you're working in leadership and training, you don't have all the answers, and you need to draw on the kind of rich resource that you've got in the room to hear other people's views as well.
Yeah, and often there's more than one answer. It's not a single answer thing, for sure. Susie, it's been absolutely brilliant. I know that this will certainly by no means be the last time you feature on this podcast, when we do some in the future with some other guests and bits and pieces. But I think in terms of setting out what we're trying to do, and giving a bit about you and some of the perspectives that you bring, I think that's been absolutely invaluable. I'm really grateful to you. Thanks very much.
You're very welcome. It's been lovely to chat.
Thank you.